Intro. He thought love was nothing but a lie, until her silence became the only truth he could no longer escape. Ethan Carter was 35, a man who had everything most people dreamed of: success, wealth, the kind of power that could move markets with a single decision. Yet behind the sharp suits and calculated confidence, his heart carried a quiet emptiness. He once believed in love, fiercely, desperately, but betrayal left him shattered. From that day forward, he convinced himself that love was a trick, an illusion designed to weaken men like him. Then came Isabella Moore. She was 27, a teacher whose life seemed ordinary from the outside. Yet her presence carried something Ethan hadn't felt in years: calmness, patience, and a kind of warmth that didn't demand anything in return. She wasn't trying to save him. She wasn't even trying to change his mind. She was simply there. And sometimes, presence itself is the beginning of change. This story is not about fairy tales. It's about grief, healing, and the fragile truth we often refuse to face until it's too late. It's about the way love, even when ignored or denied, has a way of waiting quietly until goodbye turns it into the loudest sound in our lives. If you've ever doubted love, if you've ever pushed it away because you were afraid of being hurt again, then Ethan's journey will feel hauntingly familiar. And maybe, just maybe, it will remind you of the cost of letting fear speak louder than your heart. Before we step into the first chapter of this story, make sure you subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast, where untold stories like this one come alive, where every whisper of the heart is given a voice. Don't miss what's waiting in the silence. 1. The weight of betrayal. Ethan Carter never spoke of it, but betrayal had carved itself into the core of who he was. Years ago, when he was still young enough to believe that love could conquer anything, he gave his heart away recklessly. He trusted, he dreamed, and he built a future around someone who swore she would never leave. But promises, he learned, could be as fragile as glass. The night it broke still haunted him. He had come home early, eager to surprise her with a small gift, something simple yet thoughtful. Instead, what he found shattered not just his evening but his entire faith in love. She hadn't chosen him after all. She had chosen convenience, comfort, and someone else's arms. Ethan stood in that room, frozen, while the echoes of laughter that didn't belong to him filled the air. In that moment, something inside him closed like a steel door. His chest felt hollow, his breath shallow, and a voice in his mind whispered the words that would stay with him for years: never again. From then on, Ethan built his empire not on hope, but on distrust. Every deal was calculated, every relationship measured. Love, to him, became nothing but a clever disguise, a mask people wore until they got what they wanted. He promised himself he would never fall for that illusion again. And yet, deep down, beneath the armor of success and control, there remained a man still carrying the ghost of that night. The wound had scarred over, but it never truly healed. It was easier to call love a lie than to admit he still longed for something he didn't dare believe in. 2. A chance encounter. It happened on an evening Ethan hadn't planned for. He had been invited to a charity gala, the kind of event he normally attended out of obligation rather than interest. His world revolved around numbers, contracts, and polished conversations meant to impress. He didn't expect anything different that night. And yet, there she was, Isabella Moore, a young teacher who had been invited by a former student's wealthy parents. Stood out in a way Ethan couldn't ignore. She wasn't adorned in glittering jewels or designer gowns. Her dress was modest, soft blue against the gold-lit room, and her smile carried none of the sharp edges he had grown accustomed to in high society. She didn't try to capture attention, she simply was. Their paths crossed almost by accident. A glass slipped from someone's hand nearby, and as Ethan turned, He noticed her kneeling to help pick up the scattered shards. While others kept chatting, Isabella's instinct was to care. He watched as she reassured the embarrassed waiter with a kindness that seemed effortless. When she finally looked up, their eyes met. Ethan had seen countless faces, studied thousands of expressions in boardrooms and parties, but hers struck him differently. There was no calculation in her gaze, just openness. A quiet steadiness that unsettled him more than any rivalry ever had. They exchanged only a few words that night, polite and brief, but for the first time in years, Ethan felt something stir, a flicker. Faint and unwelcome, yet impossible to deny. It wasn't attraction alone. It was the uncomfortable realization that perhaps love, the lie he had sworn never to believe in again, might still have a voice, and that voice had just whispered through her presence. 3. Walls around his heart. Ethan had always been good at building walls, ones you couldn't see, but could feel in every conversation. The morning after the gala, when Isabella's quiet steadiness lingered in his mind, he tried to brush it aside. To him, her kindness was nothing but naive optimism, the sort of softness that would eventually shatter against reality. When they crossed paths again at another gathering, Isabella greeted him with that same unguarded smile. Ethan responded politely, his words clipped and formal, his tone cool enough to remind her of the distance he wanted to keep. He told himself it was better this way. Affection, he believed, only led to weakness. But Isabella was not easily discouraged. She didn't argue with his cynicism, nor did she try to convince him otherwise. Instead, she listened. She noticed the way his eyes grew darker when conversations shifted toward love or trust. She saw how quickly he redirected the subject, as if afraid the very words might reopen wounds he wasn't ready to face. Ethan hated how transparent she made him feel. Most people only saw the polished exterior, the successful entrepreneur, the decisive leader, the man impossible to shake. But Isabella seemed to see through the armor without even trying. It unsettled him, as though she were holding a mirror to a part of himself he had spent years burying. And so he withdrew. Every instinct screamed for him to retreat behind the fortress he had built. Yet, no matter how far he pulled back, there remained a small, stubborn truth. Isabella had already slipped past the gates. Not by force, but by presence, and that intrusion, however quiet, terrified him more than betrayal ever had. 4. Moments that stir. It wasn't one grand gesture that unsettled Ethan, it was the little things. The way Isabella laughed when a child tugged at her sleeve during a community event. The way her voice softened when she asked someone about their day, making them feel as if their answer truly mattered. These were moments he wasn't used to noticing, yet they clung to him like echoes he couldn't silence. One afternoon, he saw her kneeling beside an elderly woman, helping her adjust a shawl that had slipped from her shoulders. Isabella wasn't aware that Ethan was watching, but in her every move there was a quiet grace, an attention to the kind of details most people overlooked. For reasons he couldn't explain, the sight of it stayed with him long after he walked away. Ethan told himself it was nothing, just human decency, something ordinary, but ordinary had never looked extraordinary until Isabella made it so. He found himself replaying her expressions in his mind, the sincerity in her eyes when she listened, the unforced warmth that seemed to belong to another world. And slowly, something began to shift. The fortress he had built to protect himself didn't crumble all at once, it cracked in places so small he barely noticed. A flicker of longing passed through him when he saw her smile. A brief silence in his mind when she spoke, as though for a moment the noise of his fears went quiet. These moments didn't change his beliefs. Not yet, but they stirred something buried deep, something he thought was long dead. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt the faintest pulse of his own heart reminding him, against his will, that he was still alive. Still capable of being moved. 5. The fear of love. The more Ethan felt the stirrings of something real, the more he recoiled. Love was dangerous, he knew that truth too well. Every glance at Isabella, every uninvited warmth in his chest, felt like a hand reaching for the lock on a door he had sworn would stay closed forever. At night, when the city quieted and the mask of his public life no longer protected him, he would replay those moments. Her smile, her voice, the way she seemed to carry light into places he thought were irreversibly dark. And with each memory came a gnawing terror. What if it all ended the same way? He told himself that affection was a weakness, a trap that led only to betrayal. He reminded himself that vulnerability had nearly destroyed him once, and he had rebuilt his life on strength, on control, on never depending on anyone again. To let Isabella in, even a little, was to risk everything he had fought to preserve. So Ethan pulled back. Conversations grew shorter, colder. When she laughed, he looked away. When she spoke with kindness, he answered with indifference. He wore his detachment like armor, convinced that distance would keep him safe. But inside, the struggle only deepened. The truth he refused to face was that fear had already taken more from him than betrayal ever did. Fear had stolen his ability to trust, to hope, to believe that love could be different. And yet, every time he walked away from Isabella, every time he tried to convince himself she didn't matter, his chest tightened with a longing that contradicted the very walls he had built. Love frightened him not because it was false, but because it was real. And real meant risk, something Ethan Carter had never been willing to take again. 6. Her quiet patience. Isabella never tried to chase him. She understood, in a way that words could never explain, that hearts like Ethan's could not be forced open. So she didn't press, didn't demand, didn't drown him in questions he wasn't ready to answer. Instead, she simply remained quiet, steady, present. When Ethan pulled away, she didn't follow. When his tone turned cold, she didn't retreat in anger. She carried herself with the same calm dignity, as though she had already accepted that his battles were not with her, but with ghosts he still hadn't laid to rest. Her patience wasn't loud, it wasn't the kind that begged to be noticed. It was subtle, like the way she paused before responding, giving him space, or the way she respected the silences he left hanging in the air. At times, Ethan found her restraint more disarming than if she had confronted him. He was used to people demanding, pushing, trying to pry open what he locked away. But Isabella's quietness wasn't indifference, it was an invitation. An unspoken reminder that she was there, not to invade, but to witness. On days when his walls were tallest, she would simply sit beside him, speaking of ordinary things. Books her students loved, the garden she tended, the way the seasons changed with colors too soft to ignore. Her voice was never heavy, never intrusive, and though Ethan rarely replied with more than a few words, he listened. Against his will, he listened. Her patience was not weakness, it was strength in its most tender form. It unsettled him, because it meant she wasn't waiting for him to be someone else. She was waiting for him to remember who he already was, beneath the fear, and that kind of waiting, Ethan realized, was far harder to turn away from than any declaration of love. 7. The confession. It happened on a night when Ethan could no longer hold the weight of his silence. They had been sitting in the garden after a dinner with mutual friends. The air cool with the first touch of autumn. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Isabella looked content in the quiet, her gaze lingering on the stars as though she could read something in their glow. Ethan, however, felt the walls within him tremble. Finally, he exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His voice was low, almost reluctant. When he said, "I don't believe in love. Not anymore," the words tasted bitter, but they were honest. He expected her to flinch, to turn away, maybe even to argue. Instead, Isabella simply turned her head toward him, her expression soft, patient, waiting. He went on, the dam breaking after years of restraint. He told her about betrayal, about the night his trust had been shattered, how he rebuilt his life on caution, on power, on never giving anyone the chance to hurt him again. His words weren't polished like his speeches in boardrooms, they were jagged, raw, pulled from the deepest part of his chest. When he finally fell silent, the garden seemed to breathe with him. Isabella didn't rush to fill the space. She let the quiet settle before she answered, her voice steady but tender. "Love isn't perfect, Ethan. It was never meant to be. It hurts because we're human. But it also heals for the same reason. It's not about finding something flawless. It's about finding something real." Her words landed with a weight he hadn't expected. They didn't demand that he believe again. They simply offered another way of seeing, a reminder that maybe love wasn't the lie. But the fear that kept him from it was. 8. The turning point. In the days that followed his confession, something inside Ethan shifted, barely visible to the outside world, but undeniable within himself. The words Isabella had spoken lingered in his mind like a song he couldn't turn off. Love isn't perfect. It was never meant to be. It's about finding something real. He didn't want to admit it, but those words carried more weight than the years he had spent convincing himself otherwise. For the first time in a long while, Ethan allowed himself to stay. Not in the physical sense, he had always been present in rooms, in meetings, in gatherings, but emotionally. When Isabella spoke, he found himself listening with a focus that surprised him. He noticed the way her hands moved when she explained a story about her students. The way her laughter seemed to fill spaces without demanding attention. The way her presence made silence feel less like emptiness and more like rest. It was terrifying, and yet, it was also strangely liberating. To sit with someone without performing, without posturing, without the constant need to guard every word. Ethan hadn't realized how much he missed that. With Isabella, he began to feel the faint outlines of something he thought had been buried for good: trust. One evening, when she placed a cup of tea in front of him without asking, he looked at her longer than he intended. There was no expectation in her eyes. No demand for what he should feel, just the simple offering of presence. And in that quiet moment, he felt something stir, not the consuming fire of infatuation, but the fragile warmth of hope. He wasn't ready to call it love, not yet, but it was the beginning of a crack in the armor, the first light slipping through the fortress he had built. For Ethan Carter, that was nothing less than a turning point. 9. Her goodbye. It didn't happen with shouting or tears. Isabella's goodbye came quietly, like the closing of a door that had been left ajar for far too long. Ethan hadn't expected it. He thought her patience was endless, that her quiet presence would always be there, waiting in the corner of his guarded life. But even the gentlest hearts grow weary when they are met only with walls. That evening, she came to see him one last time. The city outside pulsed with life. But inside his apartment, the silence was sharp. Isabella's eyes held no anger, no blame, only sadness, soft and resolute. She told him she couldn't keep standing on the outside of his world, knocking on doors he refused to open. "I wanted to believe you'd let me in someday," she said softly, "but love can't survive in silence forever. It needs room to breathe, Ethan. And if you won't give it space, then I have to set mine free." Her words fell gently, but they struck harder than any betrayal he had ever known. Ethan stood still, the weight of his own fear pressing down like iron. He wanted to speak, to tell her that he wasn't ready but that he didn't want her to go. Yet the words jammed in his throat. trapped behind years of silence and pride. When she turned toward the door, something inside him lurched. The sight of her walking away carried a finality he hadn't prepared for. Betrayal had once broken him. But this unraveling by absence, was different. It wasn't someone taking love away. It was him refusing it until it slipped through his fingers. And as the door clicked shut, Ethan Carter realized the cruelest truth. Losing her wasn't punishment for believing in love. It was the cost of refusing to believe soon enough. 10. The lesson in loss. The apartment felt different after she left. It wasn't just quieter, it was hollow. Like every sound echoed in a space too empty to hold it. Ethan had lived alone for years. But this silence was unbearable because it wasn't solitude. It was absence. And absence, he realized, had a weight all its own. He replayed her words over and over. Love can't survive in silence forever. It needs room to breathe. Each time, the truth of it cut deeper. He had built his life around control. Around the certainty that if he locked his heart tightly enough, he would never be broken again. But now, staring at the emptiness where Isabella's presence used to be, he saw the flaw in that design. In keeping love out, he hadn't kept pain away, he had only ensured a different kind of suffering. Betrayal had once left him shattered. But loss born of his own fear was worse. At least betrayal had been someone else's choice. This was his doing. He had let her slip away. Not because she stopped caring, but because he refused to care openly enough in return. Days blurred together. He went to work, signed contracts, attended meetings, all with the same polished mask he had always worn. Yet behind the mask, he was haunted by the simplest of realizations. Love had been at his doorstep. Patient and real, and he had let it go. And for the first time, Ethan admitted to himself that love had never been the lie. The lie was the one he had told himself, that he was safer behind walls. That silence could protect him. That distance could keep his heart intact. All it had done was leave him empty, watching the woman who had offered him truth walk away. That was the lesson carved into him now. Not all wounds come from others. Some are self-inflicted, born of fear, and the deepest regret is realizing you had love in your hands, and you let it slip through because you were too afraid to hold it. Outro. Loss has a way of stripping away the illusions we cling to. For Ethan, the silence after Isabella's goodbye was more than loneliness, it was a mirror. A mirror that showed him what fear had cost, not just a relationship, but the chance to believe in something real, something that could have healed instead of destroyed. And maybe that is the truest lesson hidden in this story. Love is never perfect. It is fragile, unpredictable, sometimes even painful. But it is also the one thing that reminds us we are alive. That our hearts are not stone. That we are capable of both breaking and mending. The lie isn't love itself. The lie is believing we are safer without it. Ethan's journey is a reminder for all of us. Don't wait until goodbye to recognize what's true. If someone in your life embodies love through patience, kindness, or presence, don't let fear silence you. Speak before the door closes. Hold before the moment slips away. Because regret is heavier than risk. And silence can be louder than any goodbye. Now, I want to turn this story over to you. Have you ever let fear keep you from something, or someone, you knew mattered? Have you ever carried the weight of a goodbye you wish you could take back? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might just be the voice someone else needs to hear tonight. If this story touched you, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who may need its message. And most importantly, subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast, where stories like this one come alive, where every whisper of the heart is given a voice. Because the truth is, none of us are alone in our struggles. And sometimes, the right story at the right time can be the light that guides us through the dark.